So hello everyone. Today we're joined by Dr. Aviezer Tucker, who is the director of the University of Ostrava's Center for Philosophy of Historiography and the Social Historical Sciences, and who is also a Davis Center Associate at Harvard University. So we'll start off with the first question, which is, could you explain what got you interested in philosophy?
Well, my route towards philosophy may not have been um, typical. It came through a combination of history and science fiction. I started reading history when I was, let's say, 5 years old. Everybody in my family had something to do with history, and I was an avid reader. I read more history than fiction. And then I discovered science fiction, and when I was 12 or so, I read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And let me just warn the viewers, don't watch this horrible Apple uh, series based on it. It has nothing to do with Asimov's genius. And don't read also the later trilogy, what Asimov wrote when he was an old man. I mean, the original Foundation Empire, Second Foundation trilogy from 1940s. And they raised a number of questions about history. Is history ruled by laws? Can history be engineered? These were questions that really bombarded me with all sorts of philosophical thoughts. And then I started reading and I talked about it with my history teacher at the time, it was already high school, a man called Shimon O'Hara. And he told me, what you're doing is not history, it's philosophy of history. So I went to a bookstore and by that time I was 16 and asked for a book on philosophy of history. And indeed, there was an introduction to philosophy of history by a man called Leo Rauch. And then I discovered what was really interesting for me. So the question that I started up with were questions really about history. Does history have laws? Can these laws be manipulated? Is there free will? And then they developed into more epistemic questions about how do you know? How do we know about the past? What is knowledge of the past? What is the difference between knowledge of history and, let's say, knowledge of physics? And that's what brought me to the actual academic research that I've been publishing now for many more years than I care to know. And that is mostly about, indeed, epistemology. Epistemology means theory of knowledge. How do we know? Because everything we know about history is after the fact. The train always leaves the station of history before the historian arrives. There's nothing to observe. It's a mistake to think that history could, even in principle, be an observational science. There's nothing to see. We will never meet Napoleon. So how do we know? I look at every historical event as an explosion of information. It sends information signals in all directions. It's an ontology, a theory of what there is that is based on information. And most of these information signals disappear very quickly. People forget, people die, uh, documents get lost, and they get mixed a lot with noise. That is, if you look, let's say, at the Mediterranean today, and you have the perfect sociological account of what's happening in the Mediterranean societies today, it will not be enough for us to infer the Roman Empire, even though the Roman Empire, the history of the Roman Empire, even though the Roman Empire ruled that part of the world for 500 years. The reason for that is that all this information signal got mixed with a lot of noise, with a lot of things that happened since. The job of the historian then is to detect the information signal that get to the present and then distinguish them from all the noise. And how they actually do that in a theoretical way, that's what I've been working on recently, or if you can say 20 years is recent.
Okay, yeah, that's very cool. Um, I feel like a lot of people I've interviewed in the past also have arrived at philosophy through unconventional paths. And I think it's quite interesting how you went from history to philosophy of history, which is like going into the meta questions behind the subject. So the next question.
There may not be a conventional road to philosophy. Philosophy,
Yeah,
by definition, is not conventional.
yes. And all subjects lead to philosophy in some way because it's ultimately love of wisdom, right? So, next question. So, what do you enjoy most about academia?
That's a tricky question. You're going to get a very wide range of answers, and not all of them actually will be positive. Why do people go into academia? Well, academia has basically three elements. There's research, teaching, and administration. There's quite a lot of administration in academia. We fill in forms and sit on committees and that sort of thing. And that's very rarely what attracts people into academia. The attraction is a way for you to conduct research while making a living, and get somebody to pay to write the books and read the books that you're interested in. And that's the main attraction, because if you get to work 8 hours a day, even if it's a nice job, well-paid job, interesting job, you're just not going to have enough time to read and write the books that you want. In fact, I have to admit that lifetime is not enough to read and write all the things I would like to read and write. So we try and do the best. That's one element. It's the research. The other element is teaching, because when you teach, when you have to explain to people who don't know as much about your field as you do, you have to put it in simpler, more systematic way, so people understand it.
Yeah.
The effect of that is that you explain it to yourself. The dialogue is not just a dialogue that you have with somebody else, it's the dialogue that you have with yourself. And for this reason, it actually helps to clarify one's ideas by discussing them with other people. And I like sharing those ideas, because philosophy is not a profession as much as it is a vocation. It's something that you believe in, and you want to share it with other people. You want to have the conversation. The ideal philosopher is somebody like Socrates. He never wrote anything, and all his life he was just talking to people, discussing, and developing his ideas through these types of discussion. And for this reason, teaching is a lot of fun when you have a good interlocutor. And the better the interlocutor is, the more fun it is. The more, I can't say that 100% of students have always been absolutely a pleasure to teach, but a fair amount of them were. And yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So now let's move on to like some more philosophical questions. Firstly, I noticed that you've done research into Czech philosophy. So I was wondering, what is the significance of Czech philosophy in the broader Western canon?
Sure. Well, I got into it quite by coincidence. Many years ago, 1990, Václav Havel, who was the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia, came to Washington when I was a student, and he gave a speech to the joint houses of Congress, and he concluded by, if there's one thing we learned from history, it is that consciousness precedes being and not the other way around. At which point the whole joint session of the United States Congress, congressmen and senators, got up and cheered, "Yay, consciousness!" And of course, they had no idea what they were cheering for. And I wasn't that good at it either, but I recognized the language. I recognized that he was using the terminology of a philosophical school called phenomenology, that is concerned indeed with the study of consciousness. Phenomenology started, let's say, with Hegel, who used indeed the relationship between consciousness and being to explore questions that Immanuel Kant, who was the great philosopher before Hegel, raised. And then somebody called Edmund Husserl, who died in 1938, was the next great phenomenologist to develop a method called epoché, that is, you suspend the difference between objective word and subjective word, and then things appear in your consciousness, and that's how you study consciousness. So I recognize the terminology, and then I was asking myself, why is this playwright, philosopher, president using this terminology? What's behind it? And that's something that was not very well known at that time, especially because even though Havel's writings were translated into English, they were read mostly by political scientists or people in literature, not by philosophers. And the writings of the teacher of Havel, a Czech philosopher named Jan Patočka, who was a student of Edmund Husserl, at that stage were not translated into English. The situation is better now. So I read them in French at the time. I didn't know Czech yet. And then I saw here's something very interesting going on. There's a whole philosophical tradition that was translated into political dissent and then became some kind of philosophic foundation for political action. What became more interesting, perhaps, is that the main student of Husserl was a philosopher named Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger's most important book is called Being and Time, Sein und Zeit in German. And Heidegger was very influential. And yet, exactly at that time, the early 1990s, historians came with the revelations about Heidegger's activities during the Second World War and before the Second World War. And not to put a fine point on it, Heidegger was a Nazi, and a real Nazi. And the question was then, to what extent his philosophy that was so influential was polluted by his Nazi affiliation. And here I had a very interesting comparative case, because, in order to understand anything, and that's what I always tell my students, you have to compare. So, if I say that you are smart, or that you are tall, or that you have a nice character, what do I mean when I say all these compliments? Well, for this to be meaningful, it has to be comparative. I have to say, well, you are smarter than 90% of the students in your class. You are taller than this kind of population. And then the differences show what is special about each case. So here I had the perfect case of comparison, because here's a group of philosophers who are very much influenced by Heidegger and by this whole school of phenomenology and everything around it. But their politics, to a large extent, is the opposite of Heidegger's, because they were fighting for human rights, for liberalization, and there were no Nazis. So if I can find a difference between their philosophies, maybe that difference would explain the politics of it, and then what part of Heidegger's philosophy we can retain as useful, and what parts we would have to say, well, there's something very problematic there. And that was a research project. So it was a comparative project. And to put it in a nutshell, Heidegger took the human out of philosophy. So the famous expression was Dasein. It's just something that is there. And then he analyzed Dasein. The problem is that if there's no person, and then I'm oversimplifying everything. So just what you should do is you should read the book. And there I'll actually give you a screenshot of the book. You should read this book. There's also a paperback edition. Okay. The argument of the book, in a nutshell, is that the Czechs brought back the soul, or psyche in Greek, or duše in Czech. That there's no Dasein. And once you bring back the human being, and there is a human, there are certain characteristics to what it means to be a human being. There's something to defend. And that's where you get the idea of human rights, because there's human. You take the human out, nothing is left to defend. What there is in Heidegger is only the negative. There's inauthenticity, what we call inauthenticity. So the idea is basically you clear all the inauthenticities, all the things that you are not, which have to do a lot with critique of mass culture. You all use the same TikTok. You watch the same thing on TikTok. You all use the same social media. Of course, making an anachronistic argument here. You all wear this, I don't know if kids still wear Nike shoes, the same jeans, the same boy bands from Korea. What's you? What's individual? You have to eliminate all these inauthenticities, which is not really you, which is what society is forcing on you, and then the authenticity would emerge without saying anything about what is authentic. And the problem is Heidegger goes through all this process, and what's left is a Nazi, right? So that was his misunderstanding of authenticity, of his own authenticity, because it was merely negative. But in the case of the Czechs, they said a lot of things about what it means to be a human being, which, again, in a nutshell, it's life in truth. Život v pravdě in Czech. And life in truth, once you say, what is so unique about us as humans is that we can live in truth, we have a concept of truth, that encourages us to live the Socratic life, because Socrates was constantly in search of truth through dialogue. If you live in a society that does not allow free dialogue, you can't live in truth, you can't be a human being, and that's why you need a movement for human rights. Oversimplified, but that's the nature of it. And then I was lucky. I was lucky because I got a grant to spend 2 years in Prague and write a book that was paid by somebody who's very famous today, controversially, George Soros. At that time, it was not controversial at all. And of course, I'm grateful for that experience. And then I just stayed. You know, that we talked earlier about academic careers. You get a grant for a year, and then things happen. So I got a grant for 2 years in Prague, then I stayed for 6 years. And then I got a grant for 1 year to do a postdoc at Columbia University in New York. And then I stayed for 30 years because things happen. Okay.
So I think the view on authenticity is quite interesting. So do you think authenticity then is less about just rejecting like social influence, but sort of consciously embracing it as well in some way?
Right, because that depends on your view of humanity. Now, if you clear all the human elements from Dasein, it's just pure consciousness and things appear, which is what Heidegger did. What can you say about what a human being is when there is no human being? What can you say about Dasein? When the whole of being and time is about the structure of Dasein. So he has a lot to say about the structure of Dasein. But when his concept of authenticity is vacuous, he doesn't tell you what does it mean to be authentically human. He just has a lot to say about what is inauthentic. And the idea of the process, because phenomenology is not just a philosophy, it's a way of life, it's a practice. And this is what was so appealing about phenomenology for East European dissidents, not just the Czech, but also Polish and Hungarians, is that you can really do quite a lot with your life simply by having a life of the mind, not by changing a political structure that you could do nothing about when you live in a totalitarian state. And you can go through this process of becoming authentic. And definitely, if you follow Heidegger and you pay attention to all the inauthenticities, and you can also see it in Václav Havel, because Václav Havel has this famous case of the greengrocer who put a political sign in the window that he doesn't believe in, and Havel asks, why is he doing it when he doesn't even know what it means? And the answer is because he's under pressure, because people pressure him to be inauthentic. And then the terrible thing is that once they do that to him, he's also going to do it to other people. And then we all end up being entirely inauthentic. And you connect that you can connect it not just to a totalitarian country where it comes from above, from the state, but to any consumerist society, even if it is democratic and liberal. Because we are bombarded by advertisement, by social pressures, by doing things that are not, are not us. I like to bring the example from my own childhood. At a certain point in my high school, all the boys had to wear cowboy boots. I have no idea why everybody suddenly had to wear cowboy boots. partly, it gave us another, I don't know, 5 centimeters if we wanted to look taller, or we thought it would be cool to look like some cowboy. I have no idea. It was totally ridiculous because it was very uncomfortable. And when it was hot, it was really sweaty. And why should you wear boots when it's hot? This was the kind of inauthenticity that I got involved with because of the it's not a horrible thing. Nobody got hurt, but except my feet. But that's how people were. And there's a lot of things, especially in the teenager life, that are just like that. Why do you dress the way that you do? Listen to the music that you do. Go to the places that you go. Because of society sort of makes you do that. You eliminate that, sure, you'll be much more authentic. But Heidegger doesn't say anything meaningful about what's left. There's confrontation with, because for him, and that's also in the Czechs, the way to become authentic, the methodology is to confront your finitude, to contemplate death, which is something that also you will see in medieval philosophy or in Christian thought. In general, memento mori, remember that you are dead. Because that individuates, that's the one thing you're going to do in life with nobody else around you. You're going to confront finitude entirely by yourself. You can go to work or go to study with other people. You use public transportation with other people. You sit in a class with other people. But when you die, you're going to do it alone. And we will all die. And if you contemplate that, the question that immediately emerges is the question of meaning. So what was that all about? So it's not going to be about the cowboy boots. And it's not going to be about the TikTok or clips or whatever. It has to be something else. Otherwise, life is really a total loss, as it were. Now, what the Czechs did with it is they gave it a little bit of a twist. And rather than talk just about individual confrontation with finitude, they talk about sacrifice. Now, if you think, what does sacrifice mean? Well, sacrifice is always of something lower for something higher. So there's something that is more important for me, and I'm going to sacrifice something that is less important for me. Now, if we talk about the greatest sacrifice that anybody can make, that's the sacrifice of life, of my own life, one's own life. So what is implicit, if we are ready to sacrifice our own life, what is implicit is that there is something more important than our own individual life. And that's how we discover some kind of transcendence. And for Jan Patočka, this Czech philosopher who indeed died following police interrogation in 1977, he developed towards the last years of his life this great discussion of sacrifice, that he would really discover the meaning of life. Again, I'm simplifying, through thinking about contemplating sacrifice and then indeed practicing it. That is, going ahead and sacrificing. Because if you have a group of people who are ready to sacrifice together, they create a certain solidarity. They develop a solidarity that they are ready to sacrifice. They share something that is more important. Now, this is all beautiful. And when the transcendent thing for which you are ready to die is ideas like freedom and truth, it's one thing. But what if the thing that you are ready to sacrifice for is the folk, the nation, the Führer, the leader? There is this danger there. And to eliminate that danger or to reduce the danger, there has to be a more robust concept of what is the person, what we should be ready, what's really humanly authentic for which we are ready to sacrifice. And in that respect, I believe that these Czech authors made a genuine contribution in comparison with Heidegger.
Okay, that's really cool. So I guess you've touched on this just now, but what are some of the key ideas of Jan Patočka?
Jan Patočka. Jan Patočka dealt with the whole range of phenomenological ideas or phenomenological problems as they were dealt with as they were introduced by Husserl and Heidegger. The originality, indeed, as I just said, was this discussion of sacrifice, life in truth, care for the soul is another thing, because he doesn't talk about Dasein. The whole discussion is of the soul in the Greek sense of psyche, from which we get the word psychology, the science of the soul. And the other thing that was interesting in his and unique in his thought is philosophy of history, because at least since the Middle Ages, much of philosophy of history, when philosophers were considering history, not knowledge of history, but what I do as a philosopher of historiography, but asking big question about history, like what is the meaning of history? That's philosophy of history, something that I don't do very much. The answer was progressive, like things are getting better. There's progress. Humanity is getting more scientific, more technologically advanced. We can do things that we didn't do before. We become more humane. Our ethics is better. If you think about somebody like Steven Pinker, today he still has very much this kind of progressive philosophy of history. There are very few people who say, no, actually, it doesn't go that way. And Patočka was one of them who said, actually, he didn't see progress in history. He saw decay. Because he said the meaning of history is to look for the meaning of history. Read that again. The meaning of history is the search for meaning of history. And he said, what happens with technological civilization is we stopped asking the question, thereby emptying history of meaning. If you don't ask what is the meaning of history, then history has no meaning. And for him, he saw the height of European civilization not in the now, but in the late Middle Ages, around the 14th century, when Europe was united, there were no considerable wars. It's simplifying things. It wasn't exactly like that, but Europe that is searching for meaning and for transcendence and being united by this search. Since then, he sees actually devolution. And that's an interesting, and that's why his great book on philosophy of history, which has since been translated to English, is Heretical Essays about philosophy of history. Why heretical? Heretical because he is skeptical about progress, about the very idea that history is moving in a progressive direction. And that's a very unique perspective. It's also a very Czech perspective. Because the Czechs, as far as the second half or even earlier, the later 2/3 of the 20th century are concerned, indeed can't see any progress. I mean, they've been occupied 3 times. First by the Nazis, then the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union again. There's not much progress to see there. And that's a unique perspective, because the American perspective, or let's say the perspective that was formalized by Max Weber, is if you're Protestant and capitalist, you are going to be among the winners of history. That generates progress, at least in the material sense. The Czechs were capitalists and they were Protestants, and they had a really horrible 20th century. And it's a sobering corrective, I would say, to the standard Western progressive concept that you can't assume progress. And there are many different ways of evaluating history, and not all of them are progressive. Material progress and technological progress is not the only value out there. And that's quite original.
Yeah, I think a big issue today is people tend to focus on progress as if progress itself is the ultimate end, as opposed to progress being a means towards something higher. So yeah, I think that's quite important to recognize. So do you think the study of history can ever be objective?
Well, here's the classical philosophical answer. What do you mean by objective? If you mean existing independently out there without human beings, without a subject to study it, no. If you mean intersubjective, that is not dependent on any particular perspective, but as a result of a consensus that different people agree on something, so it's not just about one person's point of view, then yes, it can be objective. Because historiography has a set of methodologies that allow people who have very different points of view to agree about what happened. Because just think, historians have different political views, different religious views, different identities, national, non-national, non-religious. And yet they are able to agree about so much. And that agreement, this kind of consensus, would make absolutely no sense if historiography, that is, the writing of history, was purely subjective and reflecting people's ideologies, identities, and so on. And the reason why historians who have all these different identities are able to agree on so much, and in that respect, it's just like science, is the evidence that all historians share evidence. So if you ask me, why do I think there was a French Revolution? Well, I'll tell you, here are the primary sources. Things happened in France in 1789. They created these information signals that we can detect today in archives. We analyze, we use information theories to extract information from these receivers of information. We get the information signals, then we interpret them using the same methodological tools, and then that's what we agree on. What we disagree on is what's important. We can disagree on what is good and bad. We can disagree when there isn't enough evidence to really determine what happened, and then people would tend to try to extrapolate and guess or infer with low degrees of probability what may have happened. Then people are biased. But when there is enough evidence and the methodologies are good enough, then there is universal consensus. Everybody agrees there was a Second World War. Everybody agrees that one of the causes of the Second World War was the rise of the Nazis to power. Everybody agrees that the economic recession that started in 1929 was a contributory cause to the rise of Nazism, and so on and so forth. Historians agree about so much, and that's because there is objectivity there in the sense of intersubjective agreement on what is the evidence, where we find the evidence, and how to extract information from the evidence. That's what you do when you study history. It's not necessarily something that is explicit. There's not necessarily a class that says historiographic evidence and how to infer from it. It's taught usually through practice, they show you, that was the invention of the great founder of modern historiography, Ranke. Ranke invented also an institution, the historical seminar, where a bunch of people sit around a table, they look at primary documents, primary sources, and they analyze them together. And notice that this is not a subjective pursuit because it's a seminar. People sit together, they discuss. And that's what allows us to have knowledge of the past, which is indeed progressive, because we know today more about the past than we knew 10 years ago, and 10 years ago we knew more than we knew 20 years ago. And that's because of the accumulation of evidence and methodologies. And we just think how much progress we made about knowing the past because of DNA analysis, because of archaeological discoveries. For example, the discovery that we are all Neanderthals, that we are the result of hybridity between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. That, we have something between 2 and 5% of our genome is Neanderthal. That's something earth-shattering about our past, and that's something that we just discovered in the last 10 years. Before that, people were debating where did the Neanderthal disappear? Why did it disappear? Well, lo and behold, the Neanderthal never disappeared. Here they are.
Yeah. Okay, that's quite interesting. So what are some other main ideas in the philosophy of history then?
Well, I like to distinguish philosophy of history from philosophy of historiography. Mm-hmm. Philosophy of history is about the past. It's asking philosophical questions about the past. Philosophy of historiography is asking questions about representation of the past or claims that we make about the past. It's not about the past itself. So to put it very simply, philosophy of history deals with, let's say, what happened in France in 1789. What's the meaning of it, let's say. Philosophy of historiography deals with books that were written about the French Revolution, let's say, over the last 200 years.
Yeah.
Now, the questions that philosophy of history asks about the past, I think, can be divided into two groups that have answers and groups that really don't have answers. So questions of meaning, I don't think have an answer. What is the meaning of history? Well, maybe history doesn't have a meaning, but even if it doesn't have a meaning, it's not something that we can know without some kind of revelation. It's not intrinsic by studying history that we see some kind of meaning emerging out of it. It's the meaning that we give it. It depends on what we think is our meaning, and that is indeed subjective. That was why I said, for Patočka, it's interesting that for him, the meaning of history was the search for meaning. Once we stop searching for meaning, there is no meaning. That's an interesting way of looking. Then there's a group of questions about the past that I think there is an answer to, and that's where I would think it would be fruitful to concentrate. And these are questions like whether history is contingent or necessary. And that depends also on what we think contingency and necessity mean. Did it have to happen this way, or could it have been differently? Yeah. Let's put it very informally, but there are many interpretations of this trivial, perhaps, distinction between contingency and necessity, and that would give us also different answers, because major part of what philosophy does is try to clarify concepts. Because in ordinary language has a tendency to become larger and larger, to give concept broader and broader meaning, and then we get to a point where there's conceptual deflation by overinflation. Conceptual deflation by overinflation. It's like a balloon. You blow it, it becomes bigger, bigger, and then it explodes. So if some concept means everything, it means nothing. And that's, I think, part of the problem with analysis of contingency and necessity, which is probably one of the major problems of philosophy of history. Another one is about counterfactuals. That is, if I say, had Hitler died in the First World War, German history would have been affected in such and such a way. That's a counterfactual. And that's quite popular in speculative fiction, sometimes just to make a value-laden point. Sometimes it is a really serious analysis. And the question is not just what is a counterfactual, because there is a distinction between counterfactual and thought experiment, which is very often gets confused. Counterfactual is I keep history as it is, satisfy ceteris paribus condition, and then I change one thing. So I keep the whole of history as it is, and I kill Hitler in the First World War, and then I try to see what would happen. A thought experiment is the exact opposite. Thought experiment, I keep one thing from history, and then I change everything else. For example, if I say, suppose that Hitler lived today. Well, I keep one thing from history, I keep Hitler, and then I change everything else because Hitler didn't live today, and I ask, what would have Hitler done today? These are all questions that have to do with philosophy of history. Philosophy of historiography, by contrast, is basically about books about history, the methodology of historians. So it's not so much about ontology, but what there is, what could be, but about epistemology. How do we know the past? What are the methodologies that historians are using? How similar or different they are to the methodologies that scientists like physicists and so on are doing. My argument has been, because some philosophers claim that what is distinct about historiography is it deals with people, and we are capable of having empathy with other people. My argument, however, is that what is distinctive about historiography is what it shares with all the historical sciences. most of the sciences have a historical aspect. So there's physics, and then there's cosmology. Cosmology is the history of the universe. There is biology, and there is phylogeny, the inference of the ancestry of species in the evolutionary process. There is geology that just studies rocks and rock formation. And then there is historical geology that infers the past, where the continents were millions of years ago, what geological processes happened. And the same thing is also with human history. There is the social sciences that deal with society and economy. They don't have a particular space and a particular time. And then there is historiography that deals with that. And in philology, you have generative philology, generative linguistics of the sort that Noam Chomsky developed, which just deals with language, not English or Chinese or any other particular language, but just language. And then there's historical linguistics, which is about actual languages and the relations between them, and inference, for example, that all the Indo-European languages had a common origin, and then historians try to know something about those origins in a nutshell.
Okay, yeah. So in that sense, would you say historiographical methods can still share some similarities with the scientific method in that there's a hypothesis which is then like verified or falsified?
Right. I claim it's different. It's different in the sense that the hypothesis of the historical sciences are about tokens, and hypothesis of the theoretical sciences or the causal sciences are about types. Let me explain that. There's a philosophical distinction between types and tokens. So if you think about letters of the alphabet, there are different letter types. There's Times New Roman, Baskerville. These are all different fonts that you can play on your computer, and they all are examples of the letter A. Whether the letter A is in Baskerville or in Times New Roman, these are all tokens. Then there's the type, which is not observable. These are all tokens of that type of, let's say, the ideal A, of the A. And all these are the A that you see in Baskerville, Time New Roman, Calibri, and so on. These are tokens of that type. Now, tokens have a distinct space and time. So if I hold a book now in my hand, and it is the now, and the book has a date when it was published, that's when this token of the letter A came into being. And at a certain point, it will disappear, and the book has a spatial location. The letter A doesn't have it. Now, when a social scientist studies revolutions, a sociologist or a political theorist studies revolution, they're not studying the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. They study revolutions in general, revolution as types, not revolution that happen at a particular place or a particular time. By contrast, a historian is not interested in revolutions in general. They're interested in what happened in France in 1789 until 1794, depending on your periodization of the French Revolution. They're interested in what happened in Russia in 1917, the Russian Revolution. And the difference is that when you're interested in something that happened at a particular space in a particular time, what you're searching for are for information signals that emanated from it. And then it doesn't matter if it's the Big Bang or the French Revolution. There was an event at a particular space and a particular time, and it sent information signals. So in the case of the Big Bang, we are detecting the background radiation and the expansion of the universe. These are all information signals that emanated from this very important event, the Big Bang. With the French Revolution, we find information signal in archives. People lived through the French Revolution, then they wrote something about it. Now, the interesting thing is that the French Revolution is unobservable. It's not just that it is unobservable to us. because we live a quarter of a millennia after the French Revolution, but it was also invisible to the people who lived there. That is, if I transported you in time through a time tunnel to Paris in 1789, what you would see is people storming the Bastille on 14 Juillet, on the 14th of July of 1789. You would see maybe the beheading of the king, but you would not see the French Revolution, because to see the French Revolution, you'd have to be at different places at the same time. It's something, it's something that's spread. There's nothing to see. In that respect, it is unobservable, just like atoms or quantum particles. What we measure are the information signals that emanate from them. The difference is that scientists are not really interested in any particular event, in any particular collusion. But sometimes experiments go wrong. Sometimes they get mixed with a lot of noise. Scientists discard a lot of experiments because they don't go well. They're interested really in what is the Higgs boson, right? They're interested in what is an atom. They're not interested in this atom, in this space, at this time. Historians are interested in a particular event at a particular time. And these are totally different interests. And for this reason, the methodologies are very different. All this element about information theories, detecting information signals, these are all typically what historians are doing. Now, if you want one clear visual criterion to distinguish historical sciences from theoretical sciences, it is tree models. That is, eventually, what all the historical sciences do is they model the transmission of information in time and something in a model that looks like a tree. So if you think about biology, there would be trees that show how species are related to each other. You must have seen this kind of tree of life. They teach it in biology. In philology, in historical linguistics, you'll see the same thing. It'll be like Proto-Indo-European languages, and then there'll be the Germanic languages. It's all about the transmission of information. In documentary theory, and how do we get to documents like the Bible, like the Homeric sagas? It will be, again, all these trees. And remember, the trees are about transmission of information. If you see that, that's historical science. What do the historical sciences do? They infer the tree. They're not so interested, notice, they're not so interested in the origin of the tree as much as in the tree itself. Because once they can get to model how the information was transmitted, they can get to the origin. There's no way of skipping that stage. So the tree is actually more important than the root, as it were.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite interesting. So the type token distinction, but applied to like methodology. Yes. So I guess we'll move on to the final question for today, which is, what are the lasting effects that totalitarianism can have on a country? Since I've noticed you've done some research on that area as well.
Yes. And what's the question about totalitarianism?
Like, what are the lasting effects that it can have?
Right. What are the lasting effects of totalitarianism? Well, what is totalitarianism? What is distinct about it? Now, what is interesting is that Aristotle, back in the 4th century BC, made a very simple distinction in political philosophy. So there's the rule of the one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. One, few, many. And if it's one, it's a king, then it's a legitimate regime, or it's a tyrant, and then it's illegitimate. Then there is aristocracy versus oligarchy. Now, what is interesting is that this Aristotelian distinction worked for 2,300 years. Look at any regime since the time of Aristotle until the 20th century, and you can put it in this two simple Aristotelian distinction. And then in the 20th century, there's an innovation, there's something new, something that Aristotle could never imagine, and that is totalitarianism. So what is totalitarianism? It's not the rule of the one, or the rule of the many, or the rule of the few. Who is ruling a totalitarian state? Who rules Hitler's Germany or Stalinist Russia? These are like the prime obvious cases for totalitarianism.
Yeah.
You want to hazard a guess?
Would it not be tyranny still?
Well, tyranny is a very simple regime to understand because in tyranny, the power structure is based on guns. If I have a tank and you have a rifle, I'm stronger because I have a tank. You can shoot at my tank and the tank will get scratched, and then I move my barrel and I blow you up. It's very easy to understand. Now, in totalitarianism, the military is actually a very weak institution. Stalin was purging the military. It's not a very strong institution, even though they have the biggest guns. So what is more powerful than the bigger guns? That's the invention of totalitarianism in the 20th century. How can somebody like Stalin or Hitler control the military and make the military so weak and still have power?
Through media propaganda, manufactured consent.
Media propaganda tyrants used before. That's not new. And that's a tool of mobilization which works up to a certain point. It can't hold the regime for a very long time, because when you get somebody enthusiastic and raise flags and so on, it can work for a few years, but then everybody gets tired. The innovation, if we were in a classroom now, I would go on, but and help you get to the answer, but we are a bit stressed for time. The innovation, the institutional innovation, is the secret police. Now, why is the secret police more powerful than the military? That's an easy one. The answer is in the question.
It's secret. And
exactly, because it's secret. You don't know who it is. Because you can try and organize a resistance, a political party, just any independent institution, a sports club with your friends. But if any one of you could be an agent for the secret police, because you don't know who they are, you can't trust anybody. And then they cannot be collective action. So that's the innovation. That's what totalitarianism introduced. Two parallel structures to society. One known, that is the party, it can be the Communist Party or the Nazi Party. One unknown, and the unknown is much more important, the secret police. It's there, you know it exists, but you don't know who it is. And that's how you can control the military, even though they have the biggest guns. Because suppose you wanted to have military coup d'etat and send the Air Force to bomb the president or whatever. If you don't know who is working for the secret police, they will snitch on you. They will catch you they will wake you up in the middle of the night just before you want to do the coup d'etat. That's the center of power in a totalitarian regime. The other thing is that since before Aristotle, there were always three realms of life and three types of relations. There's the family, there is civil society, and there's the state. So if you just think the norms that govern your behavior, so obviously you're going to behave according to different norms with your family, then people are not parts of your family. You would have a certain formal relationship with the state. That is, when you interact with the state, it can be when you get a driver's license, it can be when you pay taxes, it can be if you are conscripted to serve in the military. All these are relationships that you have with the state. And then there's the whole realm in between. So if you work for a private company, it's civil society. If you are a member of a sports club, it's civil society. If you have a business, it's civil society. If you practice religion and you go to church, it's civil society. That has always been that. What's a totalitarian innovation? Eliminate civil society. Just expand the state to take over civil society. That's something that nobody even tried before. So no independent sports club, no independent religion. Everybody is working for the state And the only alternative is just family. And there was even the attempt to penetrate the family, because when you ask under Stalin kids to inform on their elders, that breaks down the family. So, okay, and then there's one day it ends. What are the legacies? Well, the first thing is society is entirely fragmented. It's entirely atomized. People are not used to working with each other. They're used to suspecting each other. Secondly, there's all the legal issues of what to do about what happened before. A lot of people were killed. A lot of people were put in prison. So to what extent do you want to punish the perpetrators? And to what extent is it possible to compensate the victims? Not easy questions, because the worst possible thing that could happen at the end of totalitarianism is a civil war. Civil war is, everybody suffers, and then nothing is going to be achieved. So if the price of justice is the creation, or is the generation of a civil war, you don't want to go. Totalitarian regimes very often were not very good for the economy. So how can you compensate people when so many people suffer? And so many people were victims? Where do we get the resources to compensate them for restitution? Then what to do about private property that was expropriated? These are all questions, these are all legacies of totalitarianism that whoever comes after, any regime that comes after it, has to deal with. And philosophically, it has to do with issues about justice, about the past, about private property, rights. So a lot of theoretical issues that were attractive for me, plus simply the fact that I spent the 90s in a post-totalitarian society in the Czech Republic. I had a lot of experience in it, and I could see how things are. And some things in politics you have to live through. It's not enough to read books about it. And that, if you're into politics, I definitely would tell you, you got to spend some time abroad, not in the society where you grew up in. And that will help you not just to understand other societies, which is absolutely necessary to live there, but also will help you to understand your own society, because you will see the differences. And that's and then it depends on the sort of person you are, because we talked earlier about the advantages or disadvantages of academia. In my case, it certainly took me around the world. I joined philosophy and saw the world. So I worked not just in the United States, which I worked in the United States, but worked for a long time in the Czech Republic, which now I'm working there again. Actually in the same part of the world where I worked 25 years ago. So it's kind of nostalgic in a sense, but also I worked in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Australia. So that gives you a broader perspective. You see what is absolute, what is necessary. And it's a bit funny that my wife is also an academic. She's not teaching at Harvard. And we have the opposite reactions to when we get to new places. That is, you settle down. And for me, I'm always sort of hyper and excited and wow, we're in Australia. Wow, look at all the kangaroos and all the parrots and how beautiful Sydney is, and I'm all very enthusiastic. And then, I start working and so on, and then I start seeing things, I start being critical. It's not exactly how it should be. We can do this better. With my wife, it's the exact opposite. Anywhere she comes new, she hates it. So I want to go back home. I don't know how things are. And then she gradually gets used to it, and then she likes it, and then she never wants to leave. So it's that's just a bit of academic psychology. Let's put it this way.
Okay, quite cool. Yes. Okay, so thank you for the interview today. Learned a lot. And
yeah, you're welcome.